Hello and welcome. This is Little Wave at Your Stars Within. What I want to talk about today is how to find the degrees in your chart. So when you watch a video or you read an article and you see, like, for example, the current Venus retrograde that we're in here in June of 2020, right? And you see that, oh, Venus is going to retrograde at 21 degrees Gemini and going to retrograde all the way back to 5 degrees Gemini. But how does that affect your chart? People tell you to look at those degrees in your chart, and a lot of people seem to not understand exactly how to do that. And it's so much easier than it looks and sounds, and you can absolutely look at this for yourself and keep track of your chart. Even if you need a little help with the interpretation, you'll be able to see which things coming in are really going to hit your chart, and you can even just do some Google searching, some conversations. You know, if it's going to be really a personal transit coming through, maybe you get a reading. So the upcoming Mercury retrograde, right, in mid-June here is going to be, I think, 14 degrees Cancer, and that's also going back to a 5 degrees, so that's interesting, the number 5, again, going to 5 degrees Cancer. And I'll talk the specifics about the Mercury retrograde in the next video, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of how to find it in the chart. So today I'm going to use this sample chart that you can see here. So I want to just orient you to this chart. I want you to see on the left-hand side where it says the AC, you see it says 16 degrees, and it has the symbol for Leo. You do need to know your symbols a little bit. You can easily Google astrology symbols and pull up a chart that you can easily just reference, okay? So 16 degrees Leo is the ascendant. You can see the bones of the chart. So opposite the ascendant is the descendant. You see that it's 16 Aquarius, right? If you look at the top of the chart, you see 10 degrees Taurus, and the bottom of the chart, you see 10 degrees Scorpio. The other houses, it doesn't tell you specifically where they start. So the houses are on the inside, the little numbers, right? You see the number 1 right after the ascendant. The ascendant starts the first house. If you don't know what time you were born, you will not be able to have your ascendant and the specifics of the houses. Okay, so in this case, let's say we wanted to know where this Mercury retrograde is going to happen. We'll talk about the Mercury retrograde and the Venus retrograde, okay? So the Mercury retrograde is going to be at 14 degrees Cancer. Do I have Cancer? Does this affect me? Okay, everybody has every sign. Every one of the signs is around that wheel. So one of your houses is ruled by that sign. Now, if you have planets or points being like the ascendant, descendant, MC, or IC, right? Important planets or points that is going to be within those degrees, it's even more significant for you. The house tells us about the area of life that you're going to go through this retrograde. So all of us are going to go through this retrograde. And wherever Cancer is in our charts, whatever house that is, we're all going to experience it, but in different areas of life. And then for those of us who have a planet in those degrees, that particular part of us is going to get a workover, like a upgrade. We're going to go through a process, right? Because all retrogrades that come in, usually the transits we're talking about are retrogrades, sometimes eclipses and full moons and new moons, but let's just talk about retrograde for a second. The planet comes in, stations, which means stops or pauses on a degree, and then retrogrades. That's when we say it retrogrades, right? Stations, and then goes forward again. So that's a process of finding out what it's about, reflecting, going internal, learning about self, thinking about what needs to be different, and then going forward with the new action, behavior, and understanding in place. This is how we grow and learn. Okay, So let's look at this sample chart and let's identify Cancer. So you need to know what the symbol for Cancer looks like. It's the 69 symbol. And like I said, you can easily just Google a little, chart if you don't have this memorized yet. It's no problem. You'll eventually memorize it just naturally. I'm not a big believer in trying to memorize and actively work so hard to learn it. You'll just learn it by doing it over and over again. It will be a very deep understanding. And so we see where Cancer is, and it looks like it goes between the 11th house and then into the 12th house. And the retrograde will start at 14 degrees. Now my guess is that's solidly in the 11th house, but we want to make sure. Does it go into the 12th house at all? In order to know where exactly that 12th house starts, we need to go to where it says PDF additional tables. And when I click that and I go to the right, I see there's a big chart at the top and then a little chart next to it. And then underneath, there's the more complicated looking chart, okay? We're gonna look not the big chart, but the one on the right where it says house and declination. Okay, so I'm going to go and look at 12th house, Cancer, 17 degrees. See how it says 17 degree and then it says 31? It's basically like 17.31, okay? So this retrograde starts at 14, so it is solidly in the 11th house. It will retrograde back to 5 degrees Cancer. Sometimes a retrograde goes into a previous house. In this case, it does not. And we see that it's going to stay there in the 11th house because we see Chiron is there very clearly at 2 degrees. And so while the retrograde won't go as far back as 2 degrees, I would probably note that this Mercury retrograde is going to get close to this person's Chiron. I think and Chiron is our wounded healer. We could talk a lot about him. I don't want to get overly detailed with him in this video, but we might talk about there being some mental healing or some healing of past views. It's in the 11th house of, sort of community, right? The community around us. So maybe some negative views of others or how we fit into society, how others have thought of us. Chiron brings healing. Mercury retrograde is always the mental process, but it's internal and reflective. And the community makes me think that this person has some healing around views of community or themselves in community. Okay? Now, let's talk about the Venus retrograde. The Venus retrograde is at 21 degrees Gemini, and it's going to go back to 5 degrees Gemini. Does this person have Gemini? We've learned everybody has every sign, so Gemini's in one of their houses. Let's figure out what house. Gemini's the sign before Cancer. It kind of looks like the Roman numeral 2. And so you see Gemini spans the 10th and the 11th house. You can see that Mars, again, if you have trouble knowing the planet signs, you could just Google astrology planet symbols and have those charts pulled up next to you. You see that Mars is at 22 degrees Gemini. So this retrograde starts at 21, so that's pretty close, but it doesn't actually cross it. So that tells me Mars is definitely involved. But the process, right? It's going to come up against Mars, retro back, and then come forward. And when it's completely done with its process, it's going to officially touch Mars at 22 degrees. So to me, probably coming out of that retro is going to be a big moment for this person. That Mars is also in the 11th house, but we're not ready to totally interpret it yet because we want to look that it goes back to 5 degrees. And Jupiter is stationed right there at 6 degrees. So that's pretty significant because they have Mars where it starts basically in stations, and then Jupiter where it retros in stations. The points it stations at are pretty significant. And this is within 1 degree. So that's very close. Jupiter, however, you see is in the 10th house. So that might have to do with the person's work or their reputation. So it's possible that this person's going to go through a transformation. This is Venus, right? So Venus rules beauty. So they might change their reputation, the way that they show up in the world. You know, if it was ascendant, I would say maybe changing their look. That could happen. But I'm more inclined to say they're changing the way that they show up in the world. And as it comes forward, they're going to learn to kind of initiate in their community differently, right? Because this is Venus. So Venus and Mars is maybe more attractive than Mars has been. Mars might be a little too aggressive in their community, right? We've got Mars and Chiron there in the 11th house. Maybe they tend to be aggressive and they don't understand that. They don't see it that way. So they see it like other people pick fights with them, but their approach might be very aggressive. So they might see something about themselves in this process and how they show up, right? Jupiter, he's a benefactor. He's joyous, and Venus and Jupiter can bring very, very good luck. There could potentially be a job offer. Probably if they were job searching, maybe a female would be interviewing them because of Venus, could be good luck. Maybe a relationship. I do find that we often like when people have 10th house influence, or when we have 10th house transits with relationships, even though it's not traditionally a relationship house. I do think it feels good because that person highlights us in the world. I think this is likely about their reputation and how they show up in the world, and then about how they build community. And after that, Venus retrograde would be the Mercury retrograde that we talked about, and the negative thinking and the change in their thinking. So this would be a big transformative period where they would change and probably become more open and more attractive to others in that way, because their energy is more open and attractive. And then in turn, they would have more positive response from community, and then it would start to change their way of viewing community and heal some wounds around that, right, that they've probably carried a long time. Okay, I'll point out just a couple other things while we have the sample chart up. You see that Mercury is up there right on the midheaven. Mercury's at 9 degrees, right? 9.57 basically. Right on the midheaven, I would notice that. You see that Venus and the Sun are very close together, 26 and 29 degrees Aries. And Venus is at 29 degrees. That's an anarchic degree, the 29 and 0. So I would notice that. You know, we'll talk about this, how I would interpret each of those types of pieces in future videos, but I'm just sort of showing you how I'm noticing a chart. Pluto down there by the IC stands out to me. That's significant, right? IC is 10 degrees, Pluto's 14. So you could watch the video about the bones of the chart to get a better sense when things are on the bones like that. And then we see this chunk in the 5th house, and we see a chunk in the 11th house. They're, you know, some of them are more in opposition than others, but there's a 5th and 11th house polarity here. There's energy in both. So I would talk a lot and look a lot about the 5th and the 11th house. I think this person's life will have a lot of 5th and 11th house influence. Okay, the last thing I want to point out to help you kind of orient towards the chart, let's look at the moon. This is a good challenge by choice. So the moon we see is at 10 degrees Virgo. If we want to be super specific, right, it's at 10.14. Is that moon in the 1st house or the 2nd house? So let's pull up our chart, right? We probably still have it up in another tab, but if you didn't follow before, additional tables, right? The smaller chart to the right at the top where it says house. Let's look at the 2nd house. The 2nd house starts at 10.3 and the moon is at 10.13. So the moon is in the 2nd house. Barely, it's on the cusp, but if we get most technical, it is absolutely in the 2nd house. So that's how you would figure that out. Looks like the water turned on for the garden. All right. I hope that this has been helpful and been a good introduction on how to use the information when you hear it and read it and watch it, and apply it to your chart, how to find out how that affects you. please feel free to drop a comment. I'd love to hear from you, and let me know what other kind of videos that you need. Namaste.